My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and told me her entire family would be spending the week between Christmas and New Year's at my house. All 28 of them. I set my coffee down, looked right back at her, and told her that sounded absolutely perfect. I even smiled when I said it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that I was already in the process of dismantling the very life she thought she'd inherited. And the real consequence, the one that would leave her and my son standing on a frozen sidewalk in the middle of a Canadian January with no heat, no recourse, and 30 furious relatives watching. That was still 3 weeks away. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Hamish. I'm 63 years old. For 38 years, I worked as a civil engineer for the federal government, designing and overseeing the construction of highway corridors and overpass structures across Ontario and Quebec. I spent my career calculating load tolerances, identifying structural fatigue, and deciding, sometimes in a single morning, which bridge could bear the weight and which one needed to come down before it collapsed on its own. I understand pressure. I understand failure points. And I understand, better than most, what happens when you ignore the warning signs for too long. My wife Frances and I built our home in Canada, a quiet, well-established neighborhood on the western edge of Ottawa. 2-story red brick, 5 bedrooms, a proper library where I kept my technical manuals and a few shelves of Canadian history, and a backyard that Frances spent 15 years turning into something out of a gardening magazine. She grew hostas along the fence, put in a stone path, kept a small vegetable bed going right through October. She passed away 5 years ago, ovarian cancer. She was 58 years old. After Frances died, the house went very still. I kept her garden going as best I could. I wasn't much with plants. I'd always been the one inside with coffee, watching her work through the kitchen window. But I tried. I figured she'd want me to try. And the house, though quieter, was still mine. My place, my peace. That lasted until 2.5 years ago, when my son Rory and his wife Tanya knocked on the door with a moving truck and an explanation that barely lasted 5 minutes. They told me the rental market in Ottawa had gone completely sideways, which wasn't untrue, it genuinely had. And they just needed a few months to save for a down payment, get their footing, sort themselves out. Rory is 36. He works in logistics coordination for a large shipping company. Tanya is 34. And she spends a remarkable amount of time photographing her meals and calling it content creation. I said yes because he was my son and I had the room. I cleared 2 bedrooms, put fresh sheets on the beds, told them the kitchen was theirs as much as mine. I did not anticipate that a few months would stretch into 2.5 years. I did not anticipate a great many things. The disrespect arrived the way structural damage usually does, incrementally, not all at once. Small cracks, easy to dismiss on their own, until one day you look up and realize the whole thing is compromised. Tanya left rings on Frances's oak coffee table. Not once, every single morning. I kept a small stack of coasters right beside the table, always had, but she'd reach past them for her oat milk latte and set the cup directly on the wood like the coasters were decorative. I wiped the rings away each morning without a word. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. Then came the truck. One Saturday morning in October, a brand new GMC Sierra, fully loaded, extended cab, chrome running boards, at least $85,000 Canadian, pulled into my driveway and my son stepped out looking like he'd won a radio contest. Tanya rushed from the front door squealing and throwing her arms around him. I walked out onto the porch with my coffee and asked calmly how he'd managed that. He said it was a performance bonus, a big one. I wanted to believe him. He was my kid. You always want to believe your kid. 2 days later, I was sorting through the mail on the kitchen counter when I found a statement for a joint savings account I'd set up for Rory when he was 19. I'd seeded it with $25,000 specifically for genuine emergencies. Unexpected medical bills, a sudden job loss, something real. I opened the envelope. The balance was $11.42. He'd drawn it down steadily over the past 18 months, apparently using the last significant portion for the truck's down payment and the first few lease payments. I stood in my kitchen holding that envelope for a long time. Then I folded it neatly, walked to my library, and locked it in the filing cabinet where I kept the house deed and Frances's medical records. I went back to the window and watched Rory polish the hood of his new truck in my driveway. I didn't say a single word to him, not that day, not that week. That was the moment everything shifted. He was no longer my son who needed guidance. He was a structural liability, and I had been ignoring the load calculations for far too long. The breaking point came on a night in late November. I had made a proper pot of turkey and wild rice soup, Frances's recipe, the one she'd been making since before Rory was born, and we were sitting at the kitchen table eating in near silence. Tanya was scrolling through her phone with one hand and holding her spoon with the other, not really eating. Rory was staring somewhere past my shoulder. Then Tanya set her phone face down on the table, the way people do when they're about to say something they've already rehearsed several times. She told me she'd been coordinating the family's holiday plans. Her parents, her two brothers and their families, a few cousins, her aunt who'd driven down from Sudbury. She said they usually rent a chalet near Mont Tremblant for the holidays, but this year everyone decided they wanted a real home Christmas. She said she'd offered mine. I put my spoon down. I asked how many people. She waved her hand, the gesture of someone brushing crumbs off a table. 28, she said. Maybe 30 if her cousin brought his girlfriend, arriving on the 27th, leaving on the 2nd of January. 6 nights. Before I could speak, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and slid a folded piece of paper across the table toward me. She didn't hand it. She slid it, the way someone pushes a receipt toward a contractor they expect will just sign at the bottom. She explained she was far too swamped organizing the sleeping arrangements and coordinating the family photo session to deal with groceries herself, so she'd put a list together. She said her family had particular tastes, and she wanted everything to feel perfect. I picked up the paper. It was not a grocery list. It was a procurement document, 3 pages, dense with specifics, 3 prime rib roasts from a particular butcher in the Byward Market. She'd specified the butcher by name, Quebec duck, confit from a specialty importer she'd found online. A full charcuterie spread including aged cheddar from a farm in Prince Edward County, a soft brie from Lanaudière, smoked sockeye from BC. For beverages, 2 cases of a specific Okanagan Cabernet Franc that I happened to know retailed for around $75 a bottle, a single malt scotch, a particular brand of Quebec ice cider for the dessert course. I did the mental calculation in about 45 seconds. The food alone was somewhere north of $3,000. The alcohol would push the total well past $4,000, probably closer to $5,000. She was sliding a $5,000 invoice across my kitchen table and waiting for me to nod. I looked at Rory. He was studying his bowl. I asked her, very quietly and very carefully, whether she expected me to pay for all of this myself. She sighed the sigh of a person who finds a reasonable question exhausting. She said she simply didn't have time to handle the shopping. She had the bedroom rotation to sort out, the decorations to source, the coordinated family photo outfits to organize. She looked genuinely fatigued by the scope of her own planning. Rory finally spoke. He said, "Come on, Dad, it would really mean a lot." He said I had the big Subaru for hauling, and plenty of free time during the day. Plenty of free time. Those 3 words sat in the back of my throat, like something I couldn't swallow. I looked at them both. I reached out, picked up the list, folded it along its original creases, and tucked it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I told her I understood completely. I said she had a great deal on her plate, and I would handle the shopping. She beamed. She actually clapped once, sharp and satisfied. She reminded me to call the butcher ahead of time, because the prime rib went fast this time of year. Then she told me one more thing. The sleeping arrangements. She'd sorted them out for maximum efficiency. Her parents would take the master bedroom, my bedroom, because her mother had a bad hip and couldn't be walking a long hallway to a shared bathroom in the night. It made the most practical sense. I could use the pull-out sofa in the basement rec room, just for the week. I was an early riser, she noted, so I'd be out of everyone's way before anyone was even up. My bedroom. The room where Frances and I had slept for 27 years. The room where I'd sat beside her in the final weeks, reading aloud when she couldn't sleep, holding her hand through the worst of the nights. The room where a watercolor print she'd loved hung above the dresser, and her reading chair still sat by the window with a book she'd never finished. Tanya wanted to hand that room to her parents so her mother could have convenient bathroom access. I turned to look at my son. He felt my eyes on him. He picked up his spoon and stirred his soup without eating any of it. His shoulders curved inward. He didn't look up. He said, in a voice barely above a mumble, that it was only for a few nights and it would make things much easier for everyone. That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as someone I owed anything to. It's a difficult thing to describe, the exact instant when a parent's obligation dissolves. There's no dramatics in it, no explosion, just a cold, clear settling, like a calculation finally coming out to a clean number. I looked at the top of his head and felt something close into place. He had made his choice, plainly and without hesitation. That meant I was free to make mine. I smiled. I told Tanya she made an excellent practical point. I said I would begin moving my personal things out of the master suite that weekend. She looked genuinely pleased with herself. I carried my bowl to the sink, washed it quietly, said good night to both of them, and walked down the hall to my library. I sat at my desk in the dark for a while. Then I turned on the lamp, picked up the phone, and called Baxter, my estate lawyer. I'd known him for 20 years. He was not a warm man. He didn't do warm, he did airtight. He answered on the second ring. He said he'd been expecting this call for 2 years. The next morning, while Rory and Tanya were still asleep, I sat at my desk and logged into my RBC online banking. Methodically and without any anger whatsoever, I removed Rory from every joint account we shared. I changed the passwords. I revoked his transfer privileges. I removed his name from the emergency account, what remained of it. Each step was quiet. Each step was permanent. Then I opened the credit card portal. 8 months earlier, I'd added Tanya as a supplementary cardholder on my Visa Infinite account. She'd told me it was for household expenses, groceries, cleaning supplies, the occasional repair. I'd agreed because I believed her and set a generous limit because I was, in those days, still trying to be a gracious host. I opened her transaction history. She had an expansive definition of household expenses. Charges from a Rideau Center spa, 3 separate visits to a boutique in the Glebe, a Lululemon purchase in October, a restaurant charge on a Tuesday afternoon for a party of 4, when neither Rory nor I had been anywhere near a restaurant that day. I scrolled through 6 months of transactions. The running total was $8,600 on a card she told me was for grocery runs and cleaning supplies. I did not cancel the card that night. An engineer does not bring down a structure impulsively. You plan the redistribution first. You decide where the pieces fall before you pull the pin. I placed a transaction cap on her card. Any charge over $40 would be declined. Then I scheduled a full, hard cancellation for 48 hours from that moment, timed precisely to coincide with the window she'd need to make her enormous holiday grocery run. I knew how she operated. She would wait until the last possible day. Then I opened a separate tab and looked at something I'd been deliberately ignoring for 2 years. A development company out of Toronto had been sending letters to my address every 4 months since the property values in my neighborhood had gone through the roof. My lot, a corner double lot with mature oak trees, sat at a junction they needed to complete a medium-density residential development. They had been persistent. Their most recent offer, which I had filed without responding to, was for $1.4 million, clean cash transaction, no conditions, no structural inspection required. They were going to bulldoze the building either way. A year earlier, that offer would have meant nothing to me compared to Francis's garden. But sitting in my library late at night with the grocery list pressed against my chest and the sound of Rory and Tanya's television humming through the ceiling above me, I understood something I had been avoiding. Francis was not in the walls of that house. She never had been. She was in me. The house was just a building, and right now it was a building occupied by 2 people who had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for submission. I called Baxter again the next morning. We met for lunch downtown and talked through the details over grilled salmon and sparkling water. I told him my terms. I wanted to remain the legal owner through December 31st. The title would transfer to the developer's corporate holding company on January 1st, New Year's Day, as a clean start to a clean year. And I wanted the utilities, Hydro One, Enbridge Gas, the water service, transferred to the developer's name no later than December 28th. Baxter set his fork down and looked at me over his glasses. He said that if the utilities transferred on the 28th, the heat would stop, the hot water would stop. He reminded me it would be somewhere around -15 in Ottawa. I told him I was aware of winter in Ontario. He said, slowly, and there are approximately 30 people in the house at that point. I told him there were, and I told him that was not my problem any longer. He smiled in the careful, controlled way of a man who respects a well-executed plan. He wrote down my terms. I signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. Over the next 3 weeks I packed. Not in a frenzy, methodically, the way I've always done things. I worked from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, while Rory was at his office and Tanya was sleeping or filming reels in the living room. I started in the library. My engineering references, my history books, the framed citation from the National Capital Commission, the small watercolor of the Rideau River that Francis bought at a craft fair in Manotick years ago. Boxed everything in heavy-duty containers from Home Hardware, drove them to a climate-controlled storage unit I'd rented under a numbered company Baxter, helped me register. I replaced each item with a substitute, discount store prints where the real pieces had hung, stacks of outdated Reader's Digest where my books had stood, a cheap ceramic bowl where Francis's pottery had sat on the mantelpiece. From any normal distance, the house looked exactly as it always had. Tanya walked through rooms with her phone raised for photographs and never once looked closely at anything. She complimented me once on getting rid of the clutter. I thanked her and said I wanted the house to look welcoming for her family. She said that was very thoughtful of me. She even suggested I box up some of the books in the hallway because her mother didn't like the smell of old paper. I told her I'd take care of it immediately. She went upstairs humming. In the final week, I stopped hiding the boxes entirely, since I had her explicit blessing to clear things out. I packed the workshop in the garage, leaving only a few rusted screwdrivers and an empty paint can. I emptied the kitchen cupboards of the good dishes and the decent cutlery, leaving behind the mismatched everyday plates and the drawer of random forks. If 30 people were descending on that house, they could eat off ceramic and drink from basic glass. I wasn't leaving a single item of value for them to chip, scratch, or pocket. On the evening of December 27th, I came downstairs with my coat on and my good leather travel bag, the one Francis gave me the Christmas I retired, brown leather with brass clasps, in my hand. Rory was up a stepladder, trying to loop a garland over the front entrance. Tanya was pacing the hallway with an actual clipboard, which surprised me. I hadn't known she owned a clipboard. She spotted me first. Her eyes moved from my face to my coat to the bag. She stopped pacing. She asked where I was going. She asked about the groceries. Her family was arriving tomorrow, and she had not seen a single item from the list come through the door. I told her the list was still in my shirt pocket. She told me to put my coat away and get to the Byward Market before it closed. I looked past her at Rory on his ladder. He was looking down at me now. The garland sagged in his hands. He had the expression I'd come to know well over the past 3 years, that particular look of a man who has already decided not to intervene, trying to make the decision look like it wasn't a decision. I told him I was going to Whistler for the week. I'd arranged a small rental in the village. The slopes were in excellent condition this year. They were welcome to host their 28 guests, prepare the meals, and clean up afterward. I said I was not a housekeeper, not a caterer, and not a bank. I said I was a man going on a well-earned ski trip. Tanya's face went the color of unpainted drywall. She started talking fast. Her parents were arriving tomorrow. She'd promised them the master suite, the food, the wine, the entire week. Everything was organized around the assumption that I would be there to support the logistics. She used the word support. I told her I'd left extra toilet paper in the linen closet upstairs. I said that was the full extent of my contribution. Rory climbed down the ladder. He asked me quietly to please just stay. He said he couldn't do this on his own. He said I was his father. I told him that was true, and I told him I also remembered clearly the evening he sat at my kitchen table and watched his wife arrange for me to sleep on a broken-down pull-out sofa in the basement of the home his mother and I had built together, and said not one word in my defense. I adjusted the strap of my bag, pulled open the front door, and stepped out into the December cold. A car service was waiting at the curb, headlights on in the early dark. I walked toward it without looking back. The door closed behind me with a solid, settled sound. I was on the highway to the airport within 15 minutes. My phone began buzzing before I reached the on-ramp. Rory, Rory, Rory across the screen. I let the calls stack up and watched the city lights give way to the flat dark of the Greenbelt. In the departures lounge, I ordered tea and opened the RBC app on my phone. It was there, bright and clean. a decline charge of $4,260 at a specialty food market in the Market District. Then a second attempt on the same card, declined again. I could picture exactly how that had unfolded at the register, the line of impatient holiday shoppers behind her. The polite cashier explaining the machine wasn't the problem. Tanya reaching into her wallet for her own credit cards, the ones carrying interest rates she never mentioned and balances she never discussed. I set the phone face down on the small table beside my tea. I watched the snow beginning to gather on the terminal windows. I thought about Frances. I thought about the Christmas she made shortbread from a recipe her mother had written in pencil on an index card, and the whole house smelled like butter and warm sugar, and Rory was home for the week, and everything was exactly as it should have been. That had been a very good Christmas. I picked up my boarding pass. I went to the gate. I spent the following days in Whistler the way a person should spend a week they've genuinely earned. Skiing in the mornings, reading in the afternoons, sleeping without my phone beside me. On the evening of December 28th, I opened the security camera application on my tablet. The exterior cameras were still running on a cellular backup connection. The feed loaded slowly through the mountain Wi-Fi. The house in Canada looked different. 3 rental minivans were parked across the driveway and onto the frozen lawn, but the windows were wrong. No warm yellow light. Just cold moving spots, flashlights, phone screens. The overhead lighting was gone entirely. The utility transfer had processed at 8 that morning. By standard corporate protocol for a flagged demolition site, all heating and hot water service would have been terminated remotely by midday. No service truck required. The grid simply stopped flowing to that address. Rory left 5 voicemails that night. I listened to one. He was whispering and clearly hiding somewhere. A bathroom, I guessed, and his voice was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. He said Hydro One had told him the account was closed and transferred to a commercial holding company. He said Enbridge had said the same thing. He said the house was getting cold fast, and Tanya's mother was sitting in the living room in her winter coat, and Tanya hadn't stopped crying since supper time. In the background, I could hear Tanya's father. He was not crying. He was loud. He was asking, in a voice that carried clearly through the recording, exactly what kind of establishment his daughter was running. He said he'd flown down from Sudbury in December on the understanding that there would be functioning heat. He said he had not driven a rental van through a snowstorm to sit in a dark house, watching his breath cloud in front of his face. I deleted the message. I went to sleep. The property manager arrived at 9 o'clock sharp on the morning of December 29th. I watched it from a lounge chair on the condo balcony with fresh coffee and the mountains white behind the tree line. A company vehicle and a locksmith's van pulled up to the curb. 2 men in heavy parkas walked up the front path. Tanya answered the door. She was wearing what appeared to be every sweater she owned, layered over one another, topped with the luxury cardigan she usually reserved for content creation. Her hair was loose and unwashed. She looked nothing like the woman who had slid a $5,000 grocery manifest across my kitchen table and asked if I had time to handle the shopping. The property manager explained, in the measured tone of someone who handles this regularly, that he was conducting a pre-demolition site verification. He said the property had been sold in a cash transaction and was scheduled for teardown in 72 hours. He said it had been reported that the site was not vacant as required by the sale agreement. He said that everyone currently inside the structure was trespassing, and they had 24 hours to vacate voluntarily before he involved the Ottawa police. He was professional. He was not unkind. He simply had a job to do. Behind Tanya, her father appeared. He was a large man in a fleece vest, and he moved with the energy of someone accustomed to being listened to. He announced, with some authority, that this was his daughter's home, and her husband were lawful occupants, and he'd like to see whatever documentation this gentleman was referencing. The property manager handed him the papers. Tanya's father took them. He opened the cover page. He read for perhaps 15 seconds. He went very quiet. He turned to Tanya slowly. He asked her to explain what he was holding. Tanya tried to speak. She said there had been some kind of mix-up. She said the developer had been approaching her father-in-law for years, and she hadn't known he had actually gone through with. She stopped. She looked at the floor. Rory came from the back of the hallway, dragging his feet. He looked like a man walking somewhere he already knew was going to be bad. The property manager confirmed his name from the paperwork, then handed him a formal eviction notice. 24 hours. All persons and personal belongings off the premises. Everything was documented, legal, and airtight. In the living room behind the foyer, I could see through the camera. 6 or 8 people sitting bundled in coats. Aunts and cousins. The woman I took to be Tanya's mother, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression on her face that I recognized from 38 years of engineering inspections. The expression of someone who has just understood that the structure they are standing in is not safe. Tanya's father turned back to his daughter. His voice had dropped, but the microphone caught it clearly. He said, "Did you know this was happening?" She said no. He said he wasn't confident he believed her. She said she genuinely had not known. She began to cry. She said her father-in-law had done this with no warning, had simply packed up and disappeared, and she'd had no idea. He said, in the voice of a man choosing each word carefully, in his experience, men who sell their homes without explanation have been pushed past the edge of what they were willing to tolerate. He said it sounded to him like she and Rory had made a series of very poor decisions and had now arranged for his entire extended family to absorb the consequences over Christmas. He said he was going to find a hotel. He walked past his daughter without touching her arm. Tanya's mother rose from the couch. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, not with anger, but with something quieter and harder than anger. She said she had told Tanya years ago that you cannot build a life on another person's patience indefinitely. She said she hoped Tanya would find a way to sit with that in the days ahead. Then she picked up her overnight bag and followed her husband out the front door. Within the hour, all 28 of them were gone. The rental vans backed off the frozen lawn one by one and disappeared down the street. The house stood empty, dark, and very cold. Rory called me on New Year's Eve. I let it ring 4 times and then answered. He sounded the way a person sounds after 4 days of slow, complete reckoning with the consequences of their own choices. No performance, no hysteria, just a particular kind of hollow steadiness. He said they were in a motel off the Queensway. He said the truck was going back to the dealership. He'd missed 3 consecutive payments and couldn't defer any further. He said Tanya's credit cards were at their limits, and his own weren't far behind. He said he wasn't calling to ask me for money. He just wanted me to know where they were. I sat with that for a moment. I told him I appreciated him calling. I told him I didn't regret a single step of what I'd done. I told him that the moment he watched his wife exile me to a basement pull-out sofa in the home his mother and I had built together and said nothing, that moment had cost him more than he understood at the time. I told him the door between us wasn't locked from my side, but rebuilding a relationship that had been treated with that level of carelessness would take years, not a phone call. I told him to start with the motel, week by week, and start applying for something better than where he was working. He was more capable than he'd been allowing himself to be. He didn't say much after that. We said goodbye, and I let the call end. I'm writing this from a condominium in Victoria, British Columbia, purchased outright, well within the proceeds from the Ottawa sale. It's a corner unit on the 3rd floor of a building 2 blocks from the inner harbor. The view from the living room takes in the water, the Parliament buildings lit up at night, and on clear mornings the Olympic Mountains across the strait. It is February. The crabapple trees on the street below are already starting to show the first pale suggestion of buds. Frances would have taken 400 photographs of those trees by now. Her photo is on the bookshelf. It's from a canoe trip we took to Algonquin in 2001. She's laughing at something off camera, her hair still tangled from the paddle, a tin mug in her hand. I've moved that photograph through 4 different locations in 5 years, trying to find the spot where she looks most like herself. This is the right spot. I'm certain of it now. There are people who will hear this and say I was too hard on my son. That family is family regardless of what they do. I don't argue with that instinct. I understand it. But family is not an arrangement where one person gives indefinitely while the other takes without acknowledgement. And the word love functions as the reason the arrangement should never be examined or changed. I spent 38 years working on structures that were expected to carry enormous weight. I understood, at a professional level, that a load-bearing element that is consistently overloaded and never reinforced will fail. The only question is whether the failure is planned or catastrophic. What I planned was careful. What I removed was a burden I had never agreed to carry. And what I found on the other side of it was something I had almost forgotten was available to me, the particular silence of a morning that belongs entirely to yourself. The harbor is still this morning. The first ferry from Swartz Bay is crossing the water, white against gray. I have good coffee and a book I have been meaning to finish for 3 years. I have no grievances worth carrying. I have no complaints at all.